And take a look. This is the face tonight of Alec Murdaugh, convicted killer, his head shaven at a South Carolina prison system intake facility, on his way within the next several weeks to serving 2 consecutive life sentences, life without parole, for murdering his wife Maggie and son Paul. This is also the face of a man whose family name was once synonymous with the law in the county in South Carolina that he lived in, the scion of multiple generations of Murdaughs in the legal profession and criminal justice system there. At today's hearing in the courthouse where his grandfather's portrait once hung, Murdaugh was sentenced. He spoke briefly, but Judge Clifton Newman had the last word.
I would never, under any circumstances, hurt my wife Maggie, and I would never, under any circumstances, hurt my son Paul.
Well, and it might not have been you. It might have been the monster you become when you take 15, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 opioid pills. Maybe you become another person.
Well, tonight, a primetime exclusive interview with Creighton Waters, lead prosecutor in the case, who made it plain in his remarks today in court exactly who Alec Murdaugh was to him.
No one who thought they were close to this man knew who he really was, and Your Honor, that's chilling. And I've looked in his eyes, and he liked to stare me down as he would walk by me during this trial. And I could see the real Alex Murdaugh when he looked at me.
Mr. Waters, thanks for joining us. We just heard you say that you knew Alec Murdaugh was the killer as soon as you looked into his eyes. When you heard him today continuing to declare his innocence, I'm wondering what went through your mind.
Nothing more than the same. I think after he said that, I got up and said words to the effect of what more needs to be said. You know, the truth is not in this man, and I think that was a big part of what the jury saw, and certainly a part of, I believe, what led them to the right verdict that they reached.
Were you surprised at all by the speed of the jury's deliberations?
Well, I've always said that, you know, trial lawyers tend to be a little superstitious, and I try, frankly, not to think about things like that, and people come up and talk to you while you're waiting. And I'll say this, though. We had put so much out there. It had been such a huge effort by the whole team, and you saw the whole team in action. I probably was less nervous waiting for this verdict than I ever had, and not because of overconfidence, but I just felt like we had done all we could do. But yes, it's usually when you get a verdict within a short period of time, that's generally good for the state. But you never like to even consider that until you actually hear the word that you want to hear.
This was obviously a very complex trial. There was a lot of moving parts to it. A lot of evidence was circumstantial. One of the state's key focuses was the timeline that night. And when you got up and you went through all the things that would have had to have occurred to have not been Alec Murdaugh, I thought that was extraordinary. And I just want to play that for our viewers.
So what you're telling this jury is that it's a random vigilante that just happened to know that Paul and Maggie were both at Moselle on June 7th, that knew that they would be at the kennels alone on June the 7th, that knew that you would not be there, but only between the times of 8:49 and 9:02, that they show up without a weapon, assuming that they're going to find weapons and ammunition there, that they commit this crime during that short time window, and then they travel the same exact route that you do around the same time to Alameda. That's what you're trying to tell this jury?
You got a lot of factors in there, Mr. Waters, all of which I do not agree with, but some of which I do.
It's interesting, you know, obviously that timeline was very crucial evidence, and it really tells a story. We have to remember this guy was a experienced lawyer doing sometimes complex accident cases. He's a part-time assistant solicitor, and there's 100 years of prosecution legacy in his family. And so as we started to look at that timeline, it really appeared that this was a man who was manufacturing an alibi, and that these time periods were more compressed than seemed reasonable. And I think it's kind of ironic that he was using his cell phone and this kind of data to construct an alibi, but in the end, that kennel video, I think, really caught him. But the chain of circumstance, even though the burden's on the state, the chain of circumstances that he was trying to get this jury to believe just defied any sort of logic that this could have occurred, I think it was compelling to the jury.
Do you have any sense of when he came up with this decision to kill his son and to kill his wife? Because, as you said, he was laying the groundwork for this from, that day, earlier that day, at the very least. But do you have any sense of how long he had planned this?
One of the things I described of him, and this is why I think it was important for the jury to hear this, is I think I've used roller coaster or hamster wheel that he had been on for a decade. And it's really, as you look at it in its entirety, it's really exhausting. And these pressures were building, they were coming to a culmination, and he was running out of options. I think that the other thing that was very important to him was this family legacy. I think that was more important to him than anything, aside from his own personal things that he would suffer if all this was exposed. When that exact moment was, I don't know, but I do know that all these pressures, I called it a gathering storm, a perfect storm, were arriving on June 7th. And whether it was that day or whether he'd been thinking about it for a while, I don't think we'll ever know. There's only one person who can answer that. But what I do know is that as that storm arrived, as he was running out of options, as he was faced with ruin of not just himself, but again, that family legacy, as his son had become a liability that threatened to expose him, all those came to a head on June 7th, and that's the day they died.
You also pointed out just sort of the impunity that he, and maybe other members of his family, some of his kids, maybe Paul, but the impunity that he felt he had. I mean, it was his great-grandfather, his grandfather, his father had all been the prosecutors in this area in South Carolina. I mean, it seemed like he figured he can do just about anything.
Oh, absolutely. And that's what I never knew him. I did work with his father years ago on a case. But with Alec, as we studied this more and more, as the white collar stuff, as we investigated that over months and months of investigation, we really started to get a picture of this man in talking to the people that knew him or thought they knew him, because the one thing it ultimately revealed is no matter how close, the closest people in his life had no idea who he was, which I said was chilling. So as we started to discover that, as we started to realize that, that became very, very clear and very apparent that he had never faced accountability in his life and had always been able to escape that, and that that was more important to him than anything. That's why I was always convinced that he would testify in this case, that he was assured that he could talk his way out of it one more time. Maybe not out of all the trouble, but certainly talk his way out of this. Obviously, the jury saw otherwise.
He said it even today in the court was, I would never do anything to hurt Maggie or Paul. He said today, which obviously he was talking about the murder, but he hurt them repeatedly he was stealing money. He was ruining their lives. He was a distant father because he was a drug addict who had been lying to everybody and was stealing from all these people. The idea that he hadn't already hurt them, even without killing them, is just another lie.
Yeah, and again, I'm not a psychologist, and I'm not trying to diagnose anyone here, but I think there's an element of narcissism there. I think that to some extent, he almost saw this as a necessary action so that they wouldn't have to suffer the consequences of any of this coming out. But I think he's very careful in how he says things. He's a lawyer, and his cross-examination was very interesting in dealing with him. One of the things I wanted to do, unlike a typical cross where you really try to control the conversation, is to start with a constructive cross and get him talking, because I felt like he believed he could look at that jury and really convince them, but I felt if I got him talking, he would eventually he'd eventually lie, and they would get to see that in real time, see that in action. But I think also they got frustrated by kind of the things you're saying. If you really listen to what he's saying, it's very careful in how he words it. He says he never hurt them. At one point he said he never, quote, intentionally hurt them. A lot of times people try to live with the things they've done by, qualifying it or say that wasn't the real me or things like that. He had a very well-known and common tell that whether it was on the videos of the law enforcement interviews or even on the stand, that when he said things that are a lie, he would shake his head forward like this while he's doing that.
Is that right?
Again, those were all things for
That's
the
incredible.
jury to consider. Yeah. Yeah, and so, and I pointed that out to the jury. But I think the main thing was, establishing with them that nobody who knew this man knew who he really was. He lies effortlessly, he lies convincingly, and he looked in their eyes and lied to them about perhaps the most important fact of this whole case, about when is the last time he saw his wife and his son alive. And only when he was backed into yet another corner did he come up with this latest version. Obviously, the jury saw through that. And I think, he got up there very, very confident that he was going to, this is his community and he's always been able to do this, that he was going to, get them on his side.